Sorry?
A little bit down because it's super sensitive.
Down here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yep. Okay. Let me know when. Recording? Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, thanks for attending tonight's history class. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا إنه من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. Is it too close? Let me further away. Over here? Yeah, okay. أما بعد. Okay, so the last seerah, we covered the hijrah of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina. I'll do a quick recap tonight, inshallah. So the hijrah, I mentioned that the Prophet stayed behind until the majority of the Muslims had immigrated from Mecca to Medina. So there was an instruction, an order, command from Allah to immigrate from Mecca to Medina, and he passed it on to the Muslims. And it was a special operation which the Muslims immigrated in secret. Majority of them immigrated in secret from Mecca to Medina to avoid being captured by Quraysh, being tortured, being executed by Quraysh. The Prophet himself also intended to immigrate in complete secrecy. He instructed, so he stayed behind. He instructed his cousin Ali and Sayyidina Abu Bakr also to stay behind, whereas the rest of the Muslims who immigrated, they all left Mecca and safely arrived in Medina. Quraysh knew what was happening, but they couldn't do much about it. They tried their best to bring some people back through trickery, through lies, but they were a little bit successful. We covered also that because they were so concerned about what was happening, they held a meeting, and it was called the Dar al-Nadwa. So it's a meeting place that they had in Mecca, and they came to the decision to kill the Prophet. There were other ideas of holding him as prisoner instead of allowing him to leave Mecca. They were afraid that if the Prophet left Mecca and safely arrived in Medina, it would cause a lot of trouble, more trouble for them. So they decided to kill the Prophet. This was Abu Jahl's idea, and they decided to nominate a young man from all the tribes except for Bani Hashim, which was the Prophet's own tribe, and they were not present at that meeting. A young man he'll be armed, and this group would be stationed outside the house of the Prophet, and when the Prophet would exit his house to do for Fajr prayer, they would all stab him to death. That was the plan. Of course, at the same time this happened, Jibreel came down to the Prophet and revealed their plans to the Prophet. So the Prophet knew almost straight away after they made the decision what was happening. So he had to come up with a plan on how he would leave Mecca in secrecy while he was a wanted person. So he went to Abu Bakr and they made plans. The Prophet, when he went back to his own house, because it was to prepare himself for the trip, later that evening he found that those young men, those assassins, had already arrived earlier than expected. So Jibreel came to him and said, do not worry, just exit from the front of the house. So he exited. As he was exiting the front of the house, he was made invisible to the assassins. So to show them that he was present, and he walked right in front of them, he got some sand and poured some sand on each head of the assassins, even though they couldn't see him. and he was safely walked out and left and to Abu Bakr's house. This was at an evening. At Abu Bakr's house, they made plans on what to do. They already had, Abu Bakr already prepared 2 camels for the trip. They decided to nominate a guide, a non-Muslim guide, to guide them through the desert. And they would not take the normal route from Mecca to Medina, they would take a longer route. So partially going towards the coast, the Red Sea coast, and going inland in a zigzag fashion all the way to Medina. Also, the Prophet nominated his cousin Ali with 2 tasks. Number 1 was to sleep in his bed that night, wearing the cloak, the green cloak that the Prophet wore. So if everybody would look inside the house, from outside they'll think that the Prophet was sleeping in his own bed wearing his cloak. And the other task he assigned him was to return some valuables that had been given to the Prophet for safekeeping. The guide that they hired, the non-Muslim guide, was Abdullah ibn Urayqit. He was a trustworthy guide. He knew the desert very well, so he was able to guide them in a different route, not the usual one. They decided also to stay in a cave called Ghar Thawr. So the plan was to go south from Mecca instead of going north. 8 kilometers from Mecca. There's a mountain there, and it's high up in the mountain, not near the ground. They would stay there for 3 days, and hopefully by that time Quraysh would have known he was missing, and they would have sent out search teams to look for him, and they would have given up hopefully by 3 days. They also nominated Abu Bakr's son Abdullah to bring them news every day from Mecca, to give them up to date. And Abu Bakr's daughter, Seerah Asma, would travel from Mecca to Ghar Thawr every day, 8 kilometers, bring them food. And we mentioned that she was also heavily pregnant, so she was not very unlikely to be suspected of carrying food for them, walking 8 kilometers and climbing a mountain every 3 days. The other thing they decided was Abu Bakr's servant would bring a herd of sheep. The herd of sheep would go over the footprints that Prophet Abu Bakr would leave in the desert, in the sand, because they were going on foot from Mecca to Ghar Thawr. Despite all the precautions they took, the next day Quraysh realized that Abu Bakr and the Prophet had gone missing. So they decided to send out search parties. They put a bounty, a reward for the capture of the Prophet, a reward of 100 camels. And the search parties all had a skilled tracker, someone who was able to track people, very skilled at tracking people. They were able to track them still, despite all the precautions they took. They drove all the way to Ghar Thawr. They climbed even the mountain, or to the very cave where the Prophet and Abu Bakr were hiding inside, but they didn't look inside. This in itself was a miracle. The story of the spider web covering the mouth of the cave and the dove's eggs doesn't have, it has weak sources, so it's not a story that you can rely on. But the fact that they didn't look is a miracle in itself. So after 3 days, the Prophet Abu Bakr exited the cave and departed to go to Medina. And by that time, Quraysh had given up, although the reward was still active. So as they were traveling, in the distance, some people saw them in the distance, and they went back to Mecca and reported that they saw them. So one person named Suraqa ibn Malik heard that they were there. He wanted to claim the reward for himself, for the bounty. So he said he did to stop other people from going and capturing them. He said, I know who they are, that's not Muhammad. These are some other people. So he went himself with the intention of capturing the Prophet Abu Bakr himself. But as he got closer, his horse started to hesitate and stopped. He was able to continue to reach the Prophet Abu Bakr. But by that time, he said he no longer had the intention of capturing them, because he realized they were protected by a higher source, by a higher being, He told him about the bounty. The Prophet said to him that in future he would wear the jewelry, the bangles of Kisra, the emperor of Persia, in the future. The rest of the trip, majority of the trip, was uneventful. Near the end of the trip, they were, as they were approaching in Medina, they were nearly captured. They were captured by Buraidah ibn al-Hasib, and he had a group of 70 men. They were also intending to capture him for the bounty, to get the reward. So the Prophet, instead of panicking, he just makes da'wah to them. He recites some verses from the Quran, and they all converted to Islam. And that's the dark line, shows the route they took. And the light colored line is the normal route that the caravans take from Mecca to Medina. One thing I forgot to mention last time is the fact that when those assassins were outside the Prophet's house, they refused to enter the house because it was against the customs of the time. It was shameful to break into somebody's house. And I mention this because in a certain movie, very famous movie about the Prophet, they showed the assassins breaking into the house, approaching the bed, and as removing the blanket, they stopped killing him. They didn't kill him. This is completely against the custom of the Arabs. The other time was the following morning when they found out the Prophet was missing. They went to the house of Abu Bakr and to try and intended to speak to Abu Bakr. In fact, Abu Bakr wasn't there, but his daughter Asma answered the door. She said, when they asked her, where's your father? She said, I don't know. She was slapped in the face by Abu Jahl. But they still refused to enter the house, force their way into the house, because it was against their custom. It was shameful to do that, to break into somebody's private property. Inshallah, today we'll cover, so the Prophet is then arrived in Medina, and we'll cover that inshallah today. So the Hijrah, the Hijrah of the Prophet is important because it marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, it marks the beginning of the establishment of an Islamic state. And also, in terms of the Quran, you have some of the surahs of the Quran divided between the Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs. So what that means is, the verses that came before the Hijrah are the Meccan surahs, and the ones that came after the Hijrah are the Medinan surahs. So even after the Prophet moved to Medina, even if he had gone back to Mecca and received revelation in Mecca, after the Hijrah, is still regarded as a Medinan surah, even if he was physically located in Mecca later, after the conquest of Mecca. There are differences in the styles in between the Meccan and Medinan surahs, and I've just put in a short summary. But basically, the Meccan period was a period of preparation for the Muslims, preparation for the future, preparation of what for establishing an Islamic nation. So the Meccan surahs have the basic creed of Islam. They are shorter, many of them are shorter, they're poetic. They talk about Iman, Tawheed, life after death, perseverance, putting up with torture, with hunger, and included stories of the prophets. Medinan surahs generally are longer. They have verses talking about Sharia, law and community guidance, family and social laws, warfare and governance. So the verses which are more relevant to that situation, because in Medina they required, because they were establishing a state with a government, Islamic government, so they needed Sharia law. They needed laws about families, warfare, because that was the period they went to war during the Medinian period. And the fact that I included the second pledge, Bayt al-Aqaba al-Thaniya, the second pledge of Aqaba, to show you that during the entire Meccan period, it was summarized in a number of points here. This was the pledge that the early Muslims of Medina, before they before the Prophet immigrated, made the hijrah to Medina, they made the pledge, the two pledges. This was the second pledge. Basically, it summarizes the period of Mecca and what the preparation that the Muslims had to go through for the later period in Medina. Now, in Medina, the population of Medina would be, if you look at the population of Medina and analyze it, you had basically three types of people. You had the Muslims, you had the non-Muslims, the Mushrikeen, and the Jews. The Muslims consisted of the Ansar, the people of Medina who supported the Muslims from Mecca, and these were consisted of two tribes, Aus and Khazraj. The second group of Muslims were the Muhajirun, the people from Mecca who had immigrated to Medina, and this would eventually include the Muslims who immigrated to Abyssinia a few years earlier. And you had the Muslims from other places or tribes around Mecca and other places, so the tribe of Ghifar, tribe of Aslam. Number two was the Mushrikeen, so these were non-Jews, these were Arabs that had not yet converted to Islam. And they still formed, when the Prophet immigrated to Medina, they still formed a large percentage of the population. And these were from the tribes of Aus and Khazraj. And we'll talk about these, inshallah, in this tonight. And number three, you had Jews living within Medina itself. And they were three tribes, Banu Qaynuqa, Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. And in the near future, a fourth group would appear in Medina called the Munafiqun, the hypocrites, those who pretended to convert to Islam. Upon arriving in Medina, the first things the Prophet did, so first before arriving in Medina, he arrived in Quba, he built a mosque there, and then in Medina itself, he built another mosque, and then he declared a brotherhood between the tribes of Aus and Khazraj. These were two different tribes. This is important because historically, Aus and Khazraj had an enmity between them, even though they were both Arabs. They had long history of warfare between each other. And this warfare was encouraged by the Jews of Medina. The Jews would sell arms, weapons to the different tribes and even lend them money. So the Prophet declared a brotherhood also between the Meccan immigrants and the Medinan residents. This was done partly to ease the impact of the immigrants from Mecca arriving in Medina, because they were arriving pretty much as refugees. So they were living there in order to alleviate the pressure on the people of Medina itself. So he matched one person from Mecca with a brother from Medina, and he also encouraged the people of Medina to try and employ and help them to the Meccan immigrants to work. One example is Sa'd ibn Rabi'a, who was from Medina. He was rich, one of the rich people of Medina. He was paired with, as brother with Abdurrahman ibn Auf from Mecca. So Sa'd ibn Rabi'a was not only a wealthy person, he had two wives. So he said to his new brother from Mecca, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he said, I'll give you half of my money, because he was wealthy. And he said, I have two wives, you choose which one you like, and I will divorce her so you can marry her. So Abdurrahman said, thank you, may Allah bless you with your wives and your money. All I need to know is where the market is. So he tells him where to go, and he goes and becomes a merchant and becomes very successful in the Jewish market. The other thing about as I mentioned, it was a Jewish market. So the Prophet knew that the coal commerce was in the Jewish hands. So he wanted to establish an Islamic market instead. A market that will follow Sharia laws and people will be bound by Sharia rules. This is very important because that way people would be, anybody who's cheating would be punished according to Islamic law. And people had to be honest. People had to be avoid any, for example, things like just monopolizing certain products. So they found a place, and the Prophet was that the Muslims were able to establish their own Islamic market that competed with the Jewish market. The other thing also was the water. All the wells in Medina were owned by the Jews. The famous one was Bi'r Ruma. And the story behind it is it was owned by a Jew, of course, and this Jew would collect fees from anybody coming to collect water from this well. Of course, I think he was charged high expensive amount, high fees. So in order to take control of this well, the Prophet encouraged the Muslims to purchase the well from the Jew. So Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu offered to buy the well. He approached the owner, the Jewish owner, and he offered to pay half the price of the well. And so the owner, Jewish owner, agreed. So the agreement was, one day the people would come when the Jew owned the well on that particular day. They would come, pay the money, take water, and the next day it would be the Muslims' turn. So it would be Uthman's ownership for that day. And when it came to Uthman's turn, he would give the water away for free. Same time, the people would avoid going on the days that it was the Jews' ownership day of ownership. They would only go on the days that was Uthman, when it was Uthman who was sort of owning the well. And so the Jew approaches Uthman and said, "You've beaten me," or something, and Uthman offered to pay more money for the well. So this owner accepted, and the well became 100% owned by the Muslims, and the water was given away for free. So Bi'r Ruma is still in Medina and still has water, and I think people still use it. So the Prophet ensured he secured the water supply for the Muslims and the marketplace as well. Of course, there were the non-Muslims, the mushrikeen. The Quraysh, of course, the Muslims had left Mecca, but they didn't give up. They still wanted to go after the Muslims, fight them, even though they were not living amongst them in Mecca. So they sent a message to Abdullah ibn Ubay. Now, Abdullah ibn Ubay was technically still one of the leaders in Medina. In the message, they said to him, "You either kill the Prophet or you expel him from Medina." So Abdullah ibn Ubay decides to start a war. He gets the non-Muslims from Aus al-Khazraj, the mushrikeen, and he decides he's going to go to war against the Muslims of Aus al-Khazraj, the same tribe. The Prophet hears this and immediately goes and addresses all the people, Muslims and non-Muslims. He says, he knows that Quraysh has sent a message to Abdullah ibn Ubay. He says, "You shouldn't be afraid of Quraysh. Don't worry about them. Don't listen to them. They want to create a civil war. They are from another city. Why should they create a civil war in this is our city now?" And the second thing he said was, "Is it right for a person from Aus to kill another person from Aus? Or from a Khazraj to kill another person from Khazraj? A non-Muslim fighting a Muslim. They were in different religions, but they were still from the same tribe. They even related." And the Prophet was able to de-escalate the situation, and there was no civil war. Quraysh also declared diplomatic ties with Medina and prevented anybody from Medina from visiting the Kaaba, even though they had no right to do that. The Kaaba, they were only the custodians, they were looking after the Kaaba in Mecca. It didn't mean that they owned the Kaaba. But they thought that they could prevent anybody from Medina come to the Kaaba, to pray at the Kaaba. They tried to economically boycott the Muslims. So telling the tribes living around Medina to not conduct any commerce or trade with the Muslims in Medina. And they even tried to get the Jews in Medina on their side. Quraysh also sent a threatening message to the Muslims, saying that they were going to come and kill them all. They were going to form an army and come and kill them. Now this was a period, it was a period of what's the word? Attention in Medina. They were afraid that Quraysh might send an assassin at any moment to come and kill the Prophet. And they would have a bodyguard to protect the Prophet day and night. Until finally the Prophet received a revelation in Surah Al-Ma'idah saying that Allah will certainly protect you from the people. This verse came down. After this verse came down, he said, I do not require a bodyguard anymore. Another thing that Quraysh did, they arranged a raid. So they sent a party all the way to Medina to try and attack them. This was, I think it was at least one raid. And this occurred 1 year after the Hijrah. And they were only able to steal some livestock. They didn't. They wanted to, hoping to maybe kill the person or take some people prisoner or something, but they were able to steal some livestock, and that was the end of that. Now we talk about the Jews of Medina. So, as I mentioned, there were 3 tribes in Medina. Now, perhaps there's a way of creating a good relationship between the Muslims and the Jews. The first Qibla in Islam was towards Jerusalem. So I think the idea was that the Jews would see the Muslims as being fellow people of the Abrahamic faith, praying towards the same Qibla as the Jews. And when the Prophet arrived in Medina, he found that the Jews were fasting a certain day of the year called the Day of Ashura. And when he found out that this day was, the Jews said that they were fasting it because that was the day that Prophet Musa took them out of Egypt. So the Prophet encouraged the Muslims to fast on the day of Ashura. And this also was intended to encourage a good relationship with the Jews, and maybe even encourage the Jews to follow the Prophet as well, maybe convert. However, the reactions were generally very bad from the Jews. So the first tribe was Bani Qaynuqa. One member of that tribe was a man named Abdullah ibn Salam. Abdullah ibn Salam was a very knowledgeable person of the Torah. He wasn't a rabbi, but very knowledgeable and highly respected in the community. And he met the Prophet and he tested him with 3 questions, and which he said only a Prophet would be able to answer these 3 questions. And the Prophet was able to answer these questions correctly, and because of that, Abdullah ibn Salam converted to Islam. Now the Prophet said, Allah's Messenger, the Jews invent such lies to make one astonished, so please ask them about me before they know. So he wanted to ask that see the reaction, what reaction the Jews would have when they found out that Abdullah ibn Salam had converted to Islam. So before he converted, he was highly respected and loved in their community. So he invited some Jews to where he was and asked them, what kind of a man is Abdullah ibn Salam among you? They replied, the best of us, and the son of the best of us, and the most superior among us, and the son of the most superior among us. The Prophet said, what would you think if Abdullah ibn Salam should embrace Islam? And they said, may Allah protect him from that. They saw it as something evil. The Prophet then repeated the question. They gave the same answer. And Abdullah himself came out because he went to hide somewhere, and then he came out and said, I testify that none has the right to be worshipped except Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So he declared in front of them he had become a Muslim. So the Jews, they then said, he's the most wicked among us and the son of the most wicked among us. It's only because he had converted to Islam. So this was the attitude of the Jews. Even to somebody they even knew and they had respected, it was because he had converted to Islam, they hated him. The other 2 tribes, Bani Nadir, Bani Qurayza, again, hardly any converts. Bani Nadir, from Bani Nadir was Seerah Safiya, the wife of the Prophet. Her story is a different story, but she was narrated a story about her own father, Huyay ibn al-Akhtab. One day, Huyay ibn al-Akhtab and his brother went to speak with the Prophet. They stayed with the Prophet all day. The Prophet talked about himself and about the religion of Islam and all that. And at the end of the day, they came home. And when his daughter, Safiya asked him about the Prophet, Huyay said, I swear he is a prophet of God. So his daughter said, so what do you think about him? Oh, he said, I have nothing but enmity towards him. I hate him. Even though he knew that the Prophet Muhammad was a true prophet, and he even swore by Allah that he was a true prophet. Bani Qurayza again had no converts. That was the third tribe. So they had a very strange, very contradictory beliefs. So on the one hand, kind of like Quraysh, they knew that the Prophet Muhammad was a genuine prophet. They believed him, and at the same time they refused to follow him. So the Prophet, because the Jews refused to convert to Islam, the Prophet made a treaty with the Jews. A special treaty in which compelled the Jews to behave pretty much as the way they should. So these are the terms of the treaty. Number one, the Jews of Bani Auf, the Jews that is, in Medina, are one community with the believers. So basically he's recognizing them as a community, separate community in Medina. They had their own religion, their own way of life, and the Muslims would not interfere with that. The Jews should be responsible for their own expenditure and Muslims for theirs. So their money is their money, Muslims will not take their money, and Muslims would look after their own selves. Number three is if attacked by a third party, each shall come to the assistance of the other. This was a very important one. The Jews would, in future, violate this particular agreement. Number three. Number four, each party shall hold counsel with the other. Mutual relations shall be found on ritualness, sin is totally excluded. So consult each other on certain affairs concerning the city of Medina. Each shall contribute to defending Medina in case of a foreign attack in its respective area. Similar to number three. The signatories to this treaty shall boycott Quraysh commercially. So the Jews were compelled by this treaty to cut ties with Mecca, with Quraysh. And they shall also abstain from extending any support to them. Again, this is another item that they broke or went against. And number seven is no Jewish person shall exit Medina except with the permission of the Prophet. And this was a very important part of the treaty, and we'll come to this again. But basically, you might think it's unfair, but it was a very good reason why the Prophet put in this condition, that any Jew living in Medina had to get the permission of the Prophet. And it's very similar today if you were to travel to another country and you get a passport to travel. It's the same thing. You're basically getting permission from the government to travel. If you don't have that permission, the government will not issue a passport to travel. Now, the Jews, despite the fact that there were three very powerful tribes, they were wealthy, they still accepted these terms, which compelled them to behave in a certain way. The reasons they accepted these terms, number one, was out of cowardice. They were afraid of what might happen if they refused. And the Quran confirms this. Surah Al-Baqarah, you will surely find them clinging to life more eagerly than any other people, even more than the polytheists. So they're very protective of their own life, afraid of dying. Surah Al-Hashr, indeed there is more fear in their hearts for you believers than for Allah. So the Jews have more fear for the Muslims than they have fear of Allah. And the last one, again Surah Al-Hashr, فَأَتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ وَقَذَفَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمُ الرُّعْبَ. So Allah placed the fear in their hearts. He cast terror, horror into their hearts. So they were afraid. Allah put that fear of the Muslims in their hearts. This was number one, the cowardice. Number two, even amongst the Jews there were deep divisions. So there were three Jewish tribes, but they also were not united as a single united people. And we mentioned before there were two Arab tribes, and there were 3 Jewish tribes. Now, the 2 of the Jewish tribes had allied themselves to one of those Arab tribes, and the other 3rd Jewish tribe had allied with the other Arab tribe. And whenever there was any warfare, conflict between the 2 Arab tribes, those Jewish tribes on opposing sides would fight each other as well. And Allah confirms that there was deep division amongst them. Again, Surah Al-Hashr. Their malice for each other is intense. You think they are united, but their hearts are divided. And the 3rd reason they accepted the treaty, they had personal interests. So they were selling, they had commerce with the Arab tribes. They were selling them weapons, maybe even lending them money with interest. So they wanted to keep that relationship going with that commerce. So they accepted the conditions of that treaty. Soon after, the Jews were showing their true beliefs towards the Muslims. So some of the Jews claimed, even though the Prophet, somebody had been mentioned in the Torah, it wasn't the Prophet Muhammad. And yet it was clear that that person was Prophet Muhammad. Some other Jews pretended to convert to Islam. And then after a while they would leave Islam, claiming that in Islam they found it false. They found some things wrong with Islam, the religion. And this was to sow some doubt in the hearts of the newly converted Muslims in Medina. Inshallah, we'll cover next time. There'll be more trouble from the Jews. One incident, there was a Jew who was having a conversation with Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and this Jewish person said some bad things about Allah, saying Allah is poor, and Abu Bakr was able to control his temper, and he hit him, he bashed him. And this was unusual for somebody like Abu Bakr, somebody calm and is not known for being violent. He was so angry about what the Jewish person said, he hit him. And so this Jewish person went to complain to the Prophet. And inshallah we'll talk about that next time. And inshallah also talk about the beginning of the prelude to the Battle of Badr, inshallah. Any questions or comments? Or any questions? No? ستذكرون ما أقول لكم وأفوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك